I'm Barbara Cunningham. I'm director of the Neuroscience Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, and it's a real pleasure to join you today to tell you about brain networks enabling speech perception in everyday settings. I have a number of funding agencies I'd like to acknowledge up front: the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Defense, National Science Foundation, and the Office of Naval Research. The problem that I really worry about is how it is that when you're in a complex setting with multiple sources going on, how it is that you focus in and listen and make sense of the world. This is a particularly hard problem because in the acoustic world, all the sound out there adds up before it ever enters your ear, or if you were a machine, enters a microphone. And all of that sound has to be analyzed. And one of the big problems is separating the sound sources that make up that mixture that you're hearing or receiving in order to analyze one of the sources in the environment. Now, back in the days when we could all attend cocktail parties, I almost invariably felt like I was the person in the corner here stuck in a conversation that might not have been the most interesting thing going on in the room. But as a human, it's actually pretty easy, if you have normal hearing and are a young adult at least, to focus on something that's maybe more interesting just by directing attention. And you can nod at all the proper moments and seem like you're attentively listening to one thing, but actually listening to something else by directing top-down attention to something else. But attention, which is what enables this process, is actually pretty complicated. It isn't just about what you want to do, but also what's going on in the environment. So attention is actually a mix between simultaneous top-down goals and what's going on in the environment, the acoustics of the setting. So I can choose, if I'm this guy Sam, say, sitting here, I can choose to listen to Judy based on where she is, based on the features of her voice, if she's familiar to me, or listening for a woman, or looking at what her mouth is doing and connecting that to the speech sounds that are coming out of her mouth, so I can focus on her and what she's saying. That's top-down attention, volitionally guided attention. But the auditory system doesn't just work based on what you want to do, it's also a battle between what you want and what's going on in the environment. If Sam, sitting there listening to Judy, suddenly hears in the background his name, that's a really salient and behaviorally really important thing. And it can draw attention involuntarily away from the conversation he's trying to listen to. This could be a fleeting effect. It's not necessarily going on for a long time, but at least temporarily, attention can be diverted. Stimuli that are really important and salient can grab attention and help you by refocusing you on something that's new and novel. And this is really great if you're trying to evolve in a world where there are tigers that might come and attack you in the middle of the night, and you want to be able to react to something that you weren't ahead of time aware might be going on. And that's what allows us to monitor what's going on in the background. So attention is this really interesting mix of top-down goals and bottom-up features that grab attention involuntarily. But top-down attention, your ability to focus on what you're interested in, is actually incredibly powerful and really strong. And that's one of the things that really is important in listening in complex environments. It's also one of the things that fails if you have a little bit of hearing loss. It's one of the things that fails if you have any kind of challenge to your system. It's the first place where problems will show up. So I want to demonstrate the power of top-down attention in a couple examples. And I'm going to start by playing two sentences that are mixed together. And what I'm showing here is a time domain waveform where this is time and this is the amplitude of that mixture of sounds. And I want you to listen for the sentence that starts with her shaky, just like that. So I'm going to play it, get ready to listen, and try and report back the whole sentence. Here we go.
Their shaky increases will leap at the carpet.
Now, probably most of you had real trouble with that mixture because it was an artificial mixture. It was a mixture of the identical person speaking to you from one channel, so there was no spatial information, even if you're wearing binaural headphones, stereo headphones. And there's no meaning to the sentences to help guide you through the sentences. But even though I'm very sure that few of you are confident that you heard the right sentence that starts her shaky, probably all of you heard well-formed words. Here are the two sentences mixed together. And in fact, most of you, if I really probed you and we were in person and I could query you, most of you probably heard maybe even pairs of words, syllables that belong together. And it was only at moments where two sentences both were silent, like this crossing in time or here in time, where both sentences were silent and your brain got confused because there was no feature, no cue for you to pay attention to the correct stream. This is really interesting because it says a whole bunch of things about how attention works. Syllables, the structure of the syllables in speech, held together for most people because of the structure, because there's harmonicity, there's common onsets in frequency across time, there's correlated activity, and that structure of the sound forms those syllables that are connected in spectrotemporal space, connects them together in a way that your brain can use and can isolate them from other things. Once there are two such streams, two such sets of words going on, one or the other is typically attended and the other is put into the background because it's clearly not the same thing. And that's really evidence that there's kind of a competition, a push-pull competition, winner takes all kind of competition when it comes to attention in the auditory domain. But gluing them together properly through time is a much harder problem that requires higher order organization because there can be gaps and silences. And if those gaps and silences in two competing sentences happen to be at the same moment, there's no continuity to use. Now in the real world, you hardly ever, I've never experienced having two identical twins speaking to me from the same direction, making nonsense sentences that were grammatically proper but had no content and that could be interchanged. And that's the situation I've orchestrated here, kind of engineered it to make it hard. But if I play the two separate sentences, you will hear, here they go.
Her shaky increases will leap on their quarrel.
It's meaningful, I mean, not meaningful, but grammatically correct. And there's another sentence.
Their greedy pole ends at the carpet.
And when they mix, they sound so similar in their higher order features, it's only the local structure that holds them together to be separated from one another. And when those global, more global features of pitch, contour, and kind of other structure, when that is temporarily silenced, you run into trouble. So forming objects from an ambiguous sound mixture is actually a huge problem. And it's actually an under-constrained problem. How is it that the brain takes this mixture of sound and pulls apart the sentences or the words and then glues together words and syllables to create sentences? Well, actually all of it is based on prior knowledge that you bring to the problem. Some of it has happened evolutionarily. So in the auditory system, there are parts of the brain in the midbrain below the cortex that are designed to pick up coincidence, common onsets across very disparate frequency regions. That's a feature of sound that happens in the natural world and that isn't obvious right away, but that you can build a kind of automatic detector for that kind of feature. But that's prior knowledge. It doesn't have to be that sounds that turn on together in different frequency regions are from the same source, but when that happens, it's probably not by chance. And so we detect that and use that to separate one sound from another. Similarly, things that are harmonically related, that have a common fundamental frequency, that could happen by chance, but it's unlikely. And so things that are harmonically related are probably from the same source, and the brain treats them as if they belong together. Now, one of the things that's really fascinating is when I started studying this field, it was really not possible for a machine to solve this problem of separating sounds in a mixture of sound sources well at all. And that was one of the ways in which speech recognition failed in a lot of settings, was pulling out the speech from other background sounds was really, really difficult. But now with deep neural nets, people have been able to train in enough of the structure of natural sound into decoders to actually enable them to pull apart and segregate speech sounds. So it's something that really does require, though, an excessive amount of training and knowledge about what is it that normally happens. In the same way, the higher order features of timbre, of continuity of pitch, the pitch contour, can actually be used by the brain to connect words across time, even when there's silent gaps. What I played for you is kind of a visual, is an analog of this visual example that's on the screen now. That is, if you look carefully, you can make out words in this mixture, but they don't separate automatically because I've artificially created words that overlap in space and that are similar, same colors. So they run together, and it takes time to pull them apart from one another. This is actually important because if you have a little bit of hearing loss, if you have some sort of degraded speech, then pulling apart the features of these different sounds actually gets harder because they aren't resolved as clearly. The pitches of the sounds may not be as clear. The onsets may not be as clear. And all of that structure can be degraded. And then in that case, it takes effort to pull apart the sounds and segregate them so that you can focus on one or another. In the real world, different sounds or different objects or different words, in this case, typically, if they're independent and unrelated to one another, would not be artificially similar. And in that case, the whole way that the brain deals with that information is influenced by that difference between the words. So in this example, just by giving different colors to the different words, the whole way you analyze the scene changes. Now, it takes no time at all to focus on the red word or the blue word. That word is automatically segregated very easily from the background because it's dissimilar from everything else. And the brain uses that structure, focuses on the things that belong together, and then can use all of the time it's saved from segregating to analyze things. That turns out to be really important in real world speech because it's running, it's happening in real time. And to keep up really requires you to be able to segregate rapidly the words that you're interested in from the words that you're uninterested in order to analyze them and make sense of them. Now I'm going to play for you an example that you probably should be able to hear without trouble. And what I want to do is have you listen for a phone number in this mixture of sound. Now this phone number is spoken by a male voice. It's metallic. It's monotonized, so it has the same pitch throughout to make it easy for you to focus on. So most people should succeed at this. And it's got 7 digits in it. Now it turns out 7 is just at the limit of what you can remember if it's not something you've heard before, or can chunk, it's called. So if you want to cheat and write down the number as it's going, that's fine with me. But what I'm going to do is play the mixture for you. And in the real world, I would ask you, how many people heard it. But here we are virtually, so I won't be able to do that. But for your own sake, just write down the phone number of the male metallic voice starting now.
3 5 3 4 3 4 2.
So when I'm trying to remember it, I can kind of rehearse it. It had this rhythm, etc. So probably, if you look it down at the number, probably most of you got it. The number was 3 5 3 4 3 4 2. And usually when I've given this demo in the past, probably 90% of the people in the audience can get it. Now, I know this is a very international audience, and people for whom English is not their native language may find it more difficult because some of the segregation that we talked about isn't as automatic in your non-native tongue, because a lot of the linguistic structures in your language are so overlearned that it enhances your ability to pull out your language from other languages. Still, most people probably got that phone number. The fun part is
3 5 3 4 3 4 2.
That phone number is the phone number of a very dear friend of mine who actually today is having his retirement party. It's Steve Colburn. He's a professor at BU who I've known for years. I've been using this example for years, and I'm kind of really sad. I'm going to have to come up with a new example, but he's a wonderful, wonderful guy. And had it been, last year even, you could have called him knowing his phone number. But like I said, his retirement party is literally today. So that's the way it goes. Anyhow, here's the mix, the thing though. What else was in that sound mixture? Probably you don't really know. If I'd asked you right away, right after I'd played the sound mixture, maybe you would have been able to pull something out of memory and said something about what else was in the mixture. But you really don't process things naturally that way. Like I said, there's a constant competition between the things in the environment. Once you've formed the things from the mixture based on their structure, one or the other will be prominent and analyzed in detail, and you're only aware sort of the statistical structure of the rest of it. So it turns out the other thing is a younger version of me, made back when I made this example. And what I'd like you to do now is just listen to exactly the same sound mixture, but listen for my voice in that mixture.
3, 5, 3, 4, 3, 4, 2.
Because
it's hard to understand two things at once.
Most people, again, if it's English is your native tongue, most people for whom English is their native tongue have no problem listening to either the phone number or to my voice and can make out either with perfect clarity when they're focused on it, but they cannot process both at once. That's just not how the human brain works. And this is a really interesting and provocative thing. Now, maybe if you had a machine with infinite bandwidth and infinite power and computational power, you could analyze everything in a scene. But actually, that's not how we operate. We have limited bandwidth. We focus on one thing at a time. We analyze it in detail. If our attention is drawn away, we may miss little bits of the speech. It turns out that's okay, though, because there's enough structure and redundancy in speech that typically you can make sense of the meaning of the message, even if you don't hear every syllable. And that's, again, that's all based on prior knowledge and expectations, the kinds of things that speech researchers use to make natural language recognition work. Now, when you're directing attention in the human auditory brain, that's what I study, is how is it that we do that? What are the features that allow you to do that? And it really is fascinating because the cortical part of the brain, the part of the brain that you think of when I say the word brain, actually just coordinates immense pieces of networks of the brain to enable attention. What I'm going to show you now is this movie. And it's a movie that was made showing activity in the brain that's significantly above the baseline activity in the brain, that's significantly active when you're paying attention to something. And this is a task where the first thing that happens is a little video comes up on the screen and tells the listener to pay attention to something on either the right or the left side that's about to play, a mixture of things, that one on the right, one on the left. Now, this is a picture of the brain taken from magnetoencephalography. It's picking up the magnetic field emitted by the brain, and you can source localize where in the brain is that activity coming from. It's not particularly precise, but it's relatively precise. You can tell at least gross areas. And to visualize the area of the brain, we've taken the brain, which is this convoluted mass, and kind of exploded it, kind of filled it like a balloon, so that the surface of the brain is visible. This is the back of the brain here, the front of the brain here. Auditory cortex is sort of here. Visual cortex is here. And this front of the brain is the most evolved part. It's the part of the brain that is responsible for volitional thought and control and executive function. But the first thing that happens in this experiment is activity in the back of the brain. That's because I just played a visual cue to someone. They got that cue and they're processing it in visual cortex. Now, the next thing that happens, though, is from time minus 700 milliseconds relative to the sound, the cue in the back of the brain now has informed the person where the upcoming sound is going to come from that they have to pay attention to, which tells them also where the sound that they have to ignore is coming from. And what we're going to see is a different set of activity that starts right after the visual cue's been processed. And it starts, and you can see it going on, activity starts to appear in this region in the frontal part of the cortex. And then at time 0, sound happens. When sound happens, auditory cortex gets engaged, but all of this whole set of regions starts to talk amongst themselves, talk to each other to coordinate attention. So the interesting thing is, the minute the visual cue was processed, it told the listener which part of the world to pay attention to in space. And before the sound even started, the brain started preparing to focus attention in one direction in order to execute this task. So that's pretty cool. But what's really interesting is that spatial attention task that I just showed you, bits and pieces of anyhow, actually is engaging pieces of the brain that are not always engaged by sound, even for very similar tasks. So some work I've done with Sam Mihalka, who's now at Olin College, and David Summers, who's at Boston University, where I used to be. We looked at what parts of the brain are active during visual and auditory processing of scenes. And what we found, when you directly contrast in the same listener, what part of the brain is really active when you're paying attention to directions in space based on features of the visual world versus auditory world, you end up with interdigitated regions. So here, things that are shown in blue are the areas of the brain that are more active during visual processing than auditory processing for an auditory visual scene. You see it engages this blue, red, blue, red. These blue areas are more engaged during visual attention. The back of the brain, where the visual processing is happening, is also more heavily processed during vision, or engaged during vision. That makes perfect sense. But interdigitated with those areas, along this prefrontal areas, are these red regions. This is the left half of the brain, the right half of the brain for one listener. And you can see these orange regions are interdigitated with the red regions. And they're also talking to the auditory cortex. And so these are the networks that kind of inherently are there in the brain. And what's interesting is those same networks of auditory and visual networks that engage these interdigitated regions of the brain are actually present also when you're using working memory to process sounds. So this is work that Professor Abby Noyce is doing, and she was with me in Boston University as a postdoc and now as a professor at CMU with me. And she contrasted visual working memory, where you have to take information in and store it in the brain and recall it, for vision and for audition. And the test she used is a block comes up and it says either visual or auditory, and then a stream of faces would play. And some blocks there were male and some blocks female. And your job was to, whenever you saw a face that had happened to previously in time, press a button and say, yes, that's a target because it happened 2 ago. So you're constantly taking information, processing it, updating, rejecting that, storing a new face, etc. We wanted an analog to that, and I just love this task because the analog we came up for the auditory world was an auditory working memory task where instead of male and female faces, we used cat and dog sounds. So I'm going to give you a little taste of that task. It's a really simple task. So if you hear a repeat, oh, that happened 2 ago. That was a target. Oh, there's another target. So that task, she contrasted working memory for visual inputs and for auditory inputs. And she actually had some of the exact same subjects in this task that were used in the previous experiments of auditory visual attention. And she got almost exactly the same results. So this is one individual that was tested in 2015, and 2 years later, when they were tested in 2017 in a selective attention task for versus a working memory task. And despite the fact it's 2 years separated in time, the network is almost identical. You can see even these frontal regions, they line up really, really precisely, and that's quantified in the paper that Abby published. But it's really phenomenal stuff. So these are networks, these areas that are interdigitated are really, really biased towards either representing auditory or representing visual information. But the story's even more interesting than that. The visual processing that goes on in our brains is always spatial. Visual inputs are spatially represented at the receptor on the retina. But when it comes to sound, we don't have a reference that's spatial. For us to make sense of where in the world sound is, we have to take sound at one ear and compare it to the sound at the other ear and do complex computations and derive what that corresponds to in the world outside in space. And it turns out when we do that, it looks like we really are referring to a visual representation, a visual organization. So in Sam Mihalka's paper that I already referenced, she shows that when you make spatial auditory processing demands of a listener, they recruit the visual network. And I'm not going to go through the actual data, but the cartoon is this. There's a network that's visual that includes visual cortex and the back of the brain, which is known as parietal cortex, as well as these blue prefrontal regions. They all talk together to control visual spatial attention. When I do auditory tasks, I invoke processing in the auditory areas as well as these interdigitated frontal regions that are shown in orange. But when I do an auditory spatial task, I end up recruiting vast portions of the visual frontoparietal network, frontal in the front of the brain and parietal parts of the brain. And I end up using the visual network to do auditory spatial tasks. So you've got sensory processing, you're extracting the features of sound. I use these frontal control areas volitionally to control attention. And if that attention is to space, even if it's an auditory task, I end up recruiting areas that are in the parietal cortex that are part of the frontoparietal visual network. Now it turns out EEG, which is another technique where you put sensors on the scalp to pick up electrical voltages from the scalp, that EEG information can also be used and can reveal these differences in processing for visual versus auditory, spatial versus non-spatial features of sound. This is some work by Winko An, who's a PhD student with me at CMU now. And the idea is very similar to what I've already shown you. We give people a visual cue that tells them you're either going to pay attention to space or to the talker. It's either a male or female talker. Then we give them an auditory cue that says, if it's space, left or right attention, if it's a talker kind of attention, listen to the male or the female. So first you're told what kind of attention you're about to have to deploy. Then you're given another cue that's an auditory cue that tells you what feature to pay attention to. And then a mixture of sounds, syllables comes up. And one of them is from the left and female, one of them's from the right and one of them is male. And your job is to report back the correct syllable based on these features. And it turns out you can either attend to space. These are a whole bunch of different conditions were tested, many that are attend to space in different configurations, many that are attend to gender, and some where you don't attend at all. And you can decode, it turns out, from EEG signals on the scalp, differences in how the brain is processing based on these time points, based on whether it's attend to space, attend to gender, attend to nothing. So here's a reminder of what the task is. We compare how well you can tell the difference from using kind of simple machine learning kinds of techniques, discriminate all the different types of attention, and this is kind of a matrix of comparisons of how well you can decode from I can't decode, I'm at chance telling the difference, to I can tell the difference very well in hot colors between the different conditions. This top block is comparing conditions that are all spatial attention to themselves. This is attention to speaker, and the bottom one is do nothing. So this block here is being able to tell the difference between spatial attention and non-spatial attention. This is paying attention to space versus doing nothing. And what you'll see is a movie evolving and you'll see patterns arise in this hierarchical representation. The other thing you can look at is, here's a video, this will show a time point as we go along. This is sort of as a function of decoding time, how well can you tell the difference between these different pairs of conditions? And what you'll see is right after the visual cue starts, you start to be able to tell the difference between paying attention to things and not paying attention at all. And once the cue happens for telling you what feature to pay attention to, then you can start to differentiate forms of attention. And if you look up here, you see these patterns. It's very easy to tell the difference between spatial and doing nothing. And it's pretty easy to tell the difference between paying attention to space and paying attention to gender. Within spatial attention, you can even decode this top block is all to attend to the left. This is attend left versus attend right. You can even tell the difference between attend left and attend right. And if you do sort of a multidimensional scale analysis of this, I'll just play the movie again. Oops, I'll replay that movie. If you do a multidimensional scaling of these results, you can see that these different features start to differentiate over time. And at these points in time, even the pink leftward, pink rightward and the right leftward arrows are slightly different and discriminable a little bit. So there's all sorts of information going on before the sound that you're trying to attend to happens that is related to preparing to listen to different features of sound. Now, this parietal area is also really cool. This is this area that's part of the visual network for spatial attention. But when you do spatial attention in audition, you recruit it, you use it. And Yuqi Deng, who now works at Amazon, not Google, that's a mistake on my slide. But if you look at these parietal maps, there's sort of a real clear activity that happens. And it happens in visual attention as well as auditory attention. These parietal maps, this is kind of a top-down view of the brain. Here's the front of the brain and the back of the brain. If I look at parietal cortex in the back of the brain, there's these signs of attention that we'll talk about. And cartoon-wise, imagine that there's a sound on the left or something on the left, a girl and a man on the right, and you're trying to pay attention to one of them. The first thing to know is the representation is contralateral, so something on the external world that's left will end up being prominently represented in right cortex and in right parietal cortex. There's an asymmetry that's a little funky, which is the things on the right will also be contralaterally represented in left parietal cortex, but they also are asymmetrically represented a little bit weakly in right. And there's hints of asymmetry throughout spatial attention, as you'll see. So this is how things are represented. But what gets interesting is if I'm trying to attend to the thing on the left and ignore the thing on the right, there's a really strong envision, a really strong thing that happens. And it's pretty well known that top-down attention, deciding to listen to the thing on the left, starts a signal in frontal cortex that is sent back to parietal cortex. And when that happens, the representation in parietal cortex of the thing you're ignoring gets suppressed. In EEG and MEG, there is a marker of that suppression, which is that the representation that you're trying to suppress has an increase in brain activity in this oscillation range, oscillations in energy in the brain that happen in this 8 to 12 hertz, 8 to 10, 12 cycles per second oscillations happen. That 8 to 12 hertz oscillation is incredibly strong. It's incredibly easy to read in the EEG, and it increases over the brain in the area that is trying to suppress information. This is well established in vision, and we've demonstrated exactly that kind of thing in audition. So Yuqi Deng presented sounds from different directions. She did it by changing the interoral timing of the sound from the left ear to the right ear. So sounds leading in the left ear by 600 microseconds are shown in dark red. And then as you change the ITD to lead in the right ear by 600, you end up with blue. If you look at the left hemifield over parietal cortex, you see that the normalized, this alpha power, the power in alpha is strong when you're attending ipsilaterally to the left, and then decreases as you move your attention from left to right. And the opposite pattern is shown on the right. As you move attention from left towards the right, alpha activity increases, demonstrating this suppression of information based on this alpha. You'll also notice an asymmetry, and the asymmetry is such that in the left cortex, alpha goes from positive to negative, but on the right, it goes from 0 to positive. And that's a reflection of this asymmetry in the representation that is not perfectly symmetric. Now, another interesting thing, though, is we've already seen that parietal activity that I just showed you this signature of in the auditory world, that parietal activity is really kind of a visual representation that we're co-opting, we're borrowing to direct spatial attention. But in the real world, I might listen to somebody on my right and then recognize their voice. And once I've latched onto their voice, I may not need spatial attention to maintain fixation on their voice. In a weird situation, if I had a woman on the right and a woman on the left, and I was trying to listen to them and they sounded very similar, maybe then I might need spatial attention to maintain fixture on this voice on the right. But if the two voices, if they're very dissimilar, I don't need spatial attention once I've identified the target. So that's something that Leah Bonacci went and looked at. She now works for the Naval Research Labs. And we had very simple versions of spatial attention that weren't speech. But what we did is played 3 melodies, one to the left, one in the center, and one from the right. And the melodies, each of them could either be falling, dee, 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 zigzagging, dee, 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 or rising, dee, 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 dee. We orchestrated it so that the times of the onsets of each note in these different streams happened at different times, so you could isolate the electrical activity. I won't go into that here. But the interesting thing that she did was she played 2 versions of this sounds. One set where the 3 melodies were separated in frequency enough so that you really didn't need spatial attention once you latched onto the correct sound. On the other hand, if in the other condition with small pitch separations, the frequency separations between the streams were so small it was really hard to keep straight which stream was which, unless you used spatial attention throughout. I'll just play them. There's a little noise burst that came on that was a cue as to which location to pay attention to, and your job was to report the melody, the contour of the melody. So here's an example. So if I was listening to the middle one, it went D, D, D. And I could concentrate on the high-pitched one or the low-pitched one. I'm going to just play it again for you. So try listening for the high-pitched one in this example. Baby. You don't really, once you latch onto one, you can really pay attention to it and isolate it from the others because they're separated just enough that it makes it easy to pay attention to one or the other. I'm going to play exactly the same kind of mixture, but now I'm squishing together all of these streams and it will be much harder. Suddenly the mixture really doesn't split apart into different streams and you need spatial attention, which you're not going to be able to do over this Zoom call, but you need spatial attention to be able to do the task. And what she found is that she analyzed alpha, this activity in the back of the brain, and kind of collapsed it into just one hemifield. So she took the left hemifield and the right hemifield and kind of averaged them to look at ipsilateral alpha, the alpha for attention to the same direction. And she looked at two different time periods. The time after you knew whether to listen to the left or to the right, and after the sound started playing and you were listening attentively. When the cues were, these three streams were close together in frequency, the alpha was present once you knew where to listen and before the sound started, and then remained constant throughout the whole mixture. So you needed spatial attention, you engaged it, and then you kept it going throughout the whole presentation. But, oops, I'm going backwards. But in the large pitch separation, that's not what happened. In the large pitch separation, when the sounds were far apart and sounded like different things, you use spatial attention to latch on to the melody you were interested in. Ah, the thing on the left's going to be the high-pitched thing. Now I need to listen to the high-pitched thing. But once the sound started, spatial attention relaxed. Your engagement of this visual network went away because you didn't need space anymore. So this really highlights the fact that this processing of spatial information in the cortex really seems to be using and borrowing a network that's primarily used for vision. And only when you need that information, that spatial information, do you engage that network. If you can solve the problem just based on acoustic features, you'd no longer maintain attention and maintain this activity in this extra network. The final little piece I want to leave you with is that we've been doing some stimulation studies. This is work that I began with Yuchi and that I've done with Rob Reinhardt, who's now who is a professor at Boston University, who's an expert on brain stimulation. And the idea we had was this alpha, which is a marker of spatial attention, might be something that if it's not just an epiphenomenon, but it's actually a cause of suppression, maybe we could suppress representations by stimulating the parietal cortex with alpha oscillations of electrical activity. So we used electrodes placed in the back of the brain, or not the brain, back of the scalp, surface electrodes. And this is an image of what we simulate, what we believe the stimulation we were applying looked like. And we aimed that stimulation, we tried to concentrate the stimulation on parietal cortex. And then we had listeners do a whole bunch of different conditions, but the key conditions of interest were we had a mixture of a sound on the left and a sound on the right, and their job was to listen to the sound on the left or to the sound on the right. And we hypothesized, we compared what would happen in a sham condition where we weren't actually stimulating, but we made them think we were stimulating the brain. In the sham session, we expected alpha to be increased on the left when they're attending the left, and increased on the right when they're attending to the right, and decreased in the contralateral hemifield. On the other hand, in the stimulation session, what we did is stimulated right parietal cortex and put in an alpha oscillation into the brain. And we thought that that would lead to a problem when you were trying to listen to the sound on the left, because now we would be suppressing the representation on the left. But we didn't think it would have an effect on the right, since alpha would already be high on the right because you're trying to suppress the things in that case. So what we expected was a disruption of attention when we stimulated right parietal cortex when you were trying to listen for things on the left. And that's exactly what we found. So this is a comparison between what happened when we stimulated in TACS, that's in red, versus how well you did in the sham session. And you're looking at the change in performance relative to how they did at the beginning before we started stimulating. And what you see is when you're attending to the left, performance was significantly worse in the session where we actually inserted alpha into the brain compared to when we did a sham stimulation. It turns out, it's worth noting that we also didn't see this sort of any effect at all when we did this stimulation at a different frequency. And we also didn't see effects at all when people were not paying attention based on the location, but instead were paying attention based on the gender of the talker. And all of this kind of supports this idea that there's these networks that sometimes you use. The spatial attention network is something you use, but only when space is important, not when you can solve the problem in some other way. So I like to think about how all of this might be used for devices and next generation hearing aids and things like that. So we've now got machine learning algorithms that can segregate sound mixtures. And that, like I said, wasn't true years ago. We also have the ability to use EEG, which is great because it's a portable, cheap, very robust kind of technology that can be used to decode listener intent. And there are groups all over the world, in Oldenburg, Germany, in France, throughout the world, folks at University of Rochester, all over, who are better engineers than I am by a lot, who are using EEG systems to decode what is it that the listener is trying to do at every point in time. Imagine putting those together. You can now segregate a mixture of sound. You can use EEG to figure out what is the person trying to do. And you could use that to guide a hearing aid. What you then need though is clever algorithms to figure out what sound in this mixture that you have microphones picking up, what sound is it that the listener is trying to attend to? You could amplify it and suppress the others for them. You could also maybe use some intelligent system to figure out, well, you may be trying to listen to this, but actually there's an alarm that you need that I'm going to pass through anyhow. But you could imagine various algorithms to figure out what to amplify and what to suppress to allow people to function better in environments that are too noisy and cluttered for them to otherwise operate in. And like I said just now, you can actually maybe stimulate the brain to help guide attention and steer or maybe augment attention. So what have I gone through? I've talked to you about attention, how it operates on objects that the brain segregates from mixtures of things, either visual or auditory things. And that formation of the object is a really, really critical step. It's dependent on prior knowledge of what structures belong together and happen not by chance, but because there are natural sounds or natural objects in the world. So using the structure of speech, for instance, is one of the things that enables us to pull a talker's voice out from the mixture. Once that sound is segregated, then there are these different distinct control networks in the brain that are critical for focusing attention on one thing and suppressing other things. And there's two really obvious networks. One is kind of dominantly processing auditory inputs. One is dominantly processing visual inputs. But what's fun about it is that visual network, which is organized from the beginning, from the retina as a spatial representation, is a network that the auditory system borrows. It borrows it and uses it whenever you're trying to make sense of the spatial information in sound and use that to guide attention. Now, part of that spatial attention engages activity in parietal cortex. And there's this lateral push-pull activity of parietal alpha that reflects the spatial focus of auditory attention as well as visual attention. One of the fun things about that is that push-pull may happen to direct attention, but if the sound you then latch onto is something that's really distinct from the rest of the mixture, you release spatial attention and let go of it and use just the auditory features alone, because it's not the native way to listen. You really are borrowing a visual network. And finally, parietal alpha stimulation can be used, it looks like, to bias spatial, but not non-spatial in the task we've shown you, auditory attention. And so all of this has really important implications for hearing devices, not just for people with hearing impairments, but for any listener who may have trouble in an environment where it's very, very noisy. So I'd like to thank you for your time, and I wish I could take questions, but I look forward to anybody who wants to reach out and ask me questions offline, I'd be happy to answer them.